So look, we're going to get started. We still got some attendees who are going to join us later, which is fine. But we've got a big session to get through, and obviously everyone's got a busy day. So first of all, I wanted to thank everyone for coming and spending some time out of their day to join us here today on this topic. Today we're going to be discussing modern slavery, the Modern Slavery Act, and its impact on modern supply chains. Before we jump into the presentation and discussion, just a few housekeeping things. First of all, can everyone raise their hand? I want to make sure everyone can hear me. You've got a little icon. Yep, okay, I think everyone can hear us. That's great. No issues there. Perfect. So there is a Q&A button you'll see somewhere on your screen as the attendees. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to fire them away. Now, obviously, dependent on time at the end of the presentation, we'll certainly try to get to as many as we can. What we've done in the past and what we'll do with this one as well is if any of the questions that are asked but not answered during the presentation, we'll do our best to connect you to the right panelist for those questions to be answered following the presentation as well. So even if we don't get to them, we'll do our best after. And there's going to be a couple polling questions as well that we're going to present be asking during the presentation. Apologies. Just a quick question already. Will you be sharing the presentation? Yes, we will be sharing the presentation via a link following the presentation. So all attendees will get an email after this presentation around contact details for Lynn Felden and for Scott Alden if you have any questions regarding Freedom or holding Redlich as well. So there'll be information shared to all attendees following the presentation. So all right, so let's get started. So just a very quick intro on Bastion Consulting and myself. For those who don't know, Bastion Consulting, we've been around for about 3 years now. We are a senior supply chain search firm that covers roles across the Asia Pacific region. We are based here in Sydney, but we've worked in almost all of the major markets across this region. I myself am the owner of this company. I've been working in supply chain search for 10 plus years now. And even before that, I was a buyer and worked in operations. So supply chain for me is a big area of focus, and it's a passion for me. Now, why this topic? This is a bit of a journey, and just bear with me. Let me kind of give you a bit of context. So, I'm 38 years old, and as I've grown up, you certainly become more socially aware of the impacts of your business and your footprint and things around you. So you've been, exposed to things like discussions around forced labor or sweatshops, specifically garments. I remember being, a teenager and hearing stuff about Nike and the way products were produced. This is years ago. So it's always been something that I've kind of understood, but not fully to the extent. I myself and my family moved to Singapore in 2014 to open an office up there for my previous employer. And when I moved there, it was pretty clear that there was there's a few industries there that we could discuss around this modern slavery piece, but one specifically around construction workers there. And I'm not singling out Singapore, I love the country, but there's a lot of countries that are using labor specifically from, let's say, India subcontinent regions, so Indian, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, Pakistani, for tough working conditions. And you'd see these people or these workers working, extensive hours, 7 a.m. to 7, 8 p.m., 9 o'clock, even on weekends, working till 10 o'clock at night. Singapore, for those who don't know, is an exceptionally difficult climate to work outside. It's very humid, very hot. And so there's this working environment now, and although that it's a legal practice, they're not illegally working on premise. The working conditions, I think, would qualify for some type of modern slavery because they're paid severely under modern wages in Western markets. And the living conditions they've been exposed to and they live in are really tough. And I think you also see that in Singapore right now around the spread of COVID-19 and how that's infected a lot of their workforce there because they live in such tight proximities on top of each other. You have 8 to 10 people sharing one room. It's tough to have that separation and that space, which a lot of us are accustomed to having as well. So again, the journey for me on this topic has been seeing that and just getting exposed to it more and more and wanting to learn more about it. We moved back here, myself and my family, at the end of 2017, and I had started to attend a few sessions with an organization that brings awareness to modern slavery here in Australia, specifically in the construction industry, called Supply Chain School. So I'd been to a few presentations, and certainly something that I'm trying to educate myself more and more. And then recently, I was made aware of Lynn's new role as the managing director for Freedom and ANZ. And I'll introduce formally Lynn in a second, but Lynn and I have known each other for a long time. And I just, I'd seen this new role she had had, and I gave her a call and I said, well, congratulations. This is a fantastic opportunity. And then I started to dig into, a little bit more about what the technology can do and its applications and the benefits and such. And I found it really interesting. And so this is why we're here today. I reached out to Lynn and I wanted to share not only the legislative requirements and reporting here in Australia, but also globally when it comes to modern slavery, but how we can support this cause, what technology can enable us to have better transparency across our supply chain. So for me, this is the reason why we're here today. So now look, I'm not the main speaker here today. I'm sure there's many more people who have much more important things to say than I, but that just to give you context. So let me introduce a few of the speakers, the speakers we've got here today. So first of all, we've got Justin Dillon. Justin is an entrepreneur, author, and the founder of Made in a Free World and Freedom. He's worked in the tech and human rights space for over 10 years now. He's advised the United Nations, worked with the White House, ASX, and Fortune 100 companies in transparency throughout their supply chain. He's been in a number of publications, TV shows, and we're really fortunate to have him here today as one of our panelists. Lynn Felden. So as I mentioned earlier, Lynn I've known for about 8 years now. She is the managing director for ANZ for Freedom, MBA qualified, lifelong consultant or leading procurement professional, highly respected in the industry. She's worked for companies such as KPMG, Peugeot, NBN, and Suncorp. We've got Scott Alden with us here, a partner from Holding Redlich. Scott heads up the construction and infrastructure practice for both public and private sectors at Holding Redlich. He's been in the legal profession for 20 plus years and has a strong reputation in the water, ports, and transport tech sectors. Scott, a little bit later on in the presentation, will be giving us a little more insight around the technicalities around what modern slavery is and the compliance that not only here in New South Wales, but also Australia organizations have as well. And then lastly, but not least, we've got Tom Sykes. So Tom is the head of procurement and commercial at SEEK, MBA qualified, a long career in management consulting as well with both Deloitte and PwC in Australia and the UK. And Tom and Lynn will be discussing a little bit about Freedom and SEEK's journey around modern slavery and what that experience has been like and some of the challenges and benefits in that journey around compliance as well. So that's who we've got for our speakers today, and I really hope you guys enjoy the session. So I'll pass it over here to Justin. I'd like to introduce Justin and bring it on. Now, Justin, if you wouldn't mind just giving all the attendees a little bit of the genesis of Made in a Free World, Freedom, even slavery footprint, and just some of the work you as an individual and organization have done over the years, just to give a bit of rounded context to everyone, please.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone from California. It's a real honor to be here. Very fun to be here with the guest. To give you a little bit of background of how Freedom was created, we'd go back several years, probably 12 years is probably, if I want to be honest, be accurate, to when I started paying attention to this issue. I was coming out of a very different field at the time. I didn't know I was coming out of the field. In a lot of ways, the issue of modern day slavery kind of pulled me from a career I had in the entertainment industry and moved me into, essentially using some of the same muscle groups that we used in the music industry, using those in the movement building industry, or if that is an industry. I was part of making a motion picture on human trafficking in 2008, and at the time, this is kind of pre-social media. Twitter was just getting going. Facebook was kind of a baby. And we really wanted to be able to, if we were able to get people to pay attention to something they'd never heard of before, we wanted to make sure that they would have something to do. one of the greatest challenges about learning difficult things, whether it's about yourself or your world, is knowing what to do next. And sometimes challenges like forced labor can seem so far out, so difficult, that we don't really see our role or our place in being able to affect it. And so once we started capturing people's attention in movie theaters, we directed them towards understanding how their own lives connect to this, specifically in the things that they buy. And so the easiest thing that we could think of to do was to get them to send letters to the companies that they love. We pulled together about 400 different companies, put them on a website and said, send them letters and let them know like what you think about this and that you care about it. Just give them some consumer awareness. We didn't expect to see that, we didn't expect that over 3 million letters would get sent to companies. And those letters ended up finding their way to one of our lesser known governors here in California, Governor Schwarzenegger. Right before the end of his term, he passed a law called the California Supply Chain Act. And those letters were used as proof that consumers care about slavery and supply chains. And so the California Transparency Act was passed. And it was a big win, but more importantly, it set the stage for creating more and more acts. The one which Australia finds itself under today was a genesis out of the act that happened here in California. Once that started happening for us, I got a call from the State Department, United States State Department, to say, can we create something else? Can we do some more awareness? And we came up with this idea of creating something similar to Carbon Footprint, called Slavery Footprint. And for me, I'm a hopeaholic. I just believe there's opportunity in chaos, and I love the idea that we can all participate in changing the world. So I was not interested in creating a bummer calculator for consumers. But what I did want to do is try to find a provocative way to ask people a question that they'd never been asked before, which was, do you want to know how many slaves work for you? Believe it or not, tax dollars sponsored that question. And we ended up creating an app that consumers can go to, typing in the things that they buy, not from who they buy, but what they buy. Typing in the things that they buy on a daily basis or a yearly basis. And we would essentially tell them at the end of the survey, at the end of slaveryfootprint.org, how many slaves it takes to run your life. We give an example here of an outdoorsman who might consider himself quite ethical, and he's carrying quite a heavy load when it comes to how much forced labor it takes to just produce his lifestyle. So out of that, we expected we would get 150,000 people to, get an answer to that question. Do you want to know how many slaves work for you? That ended up becoming close to, I think, 1 million in the first day got their slavery footprint, and I think over 50 million as of today. It's still going. It's found its way into legislation. It's found its way into museums. It's found its way into curriculum. To really help people understand their own connection to this. And we were very intentional in the way we created it, because the idea here isn't that consumers can point their fingers at companies. It's really a joint responsibility for everyone to take this up. And so we created more technology for consumers to do this, but we were being overwhelmed and the organization we created to house all this activity was Made in a Free World. We were being overwhelmed with questions of who to buy from, and we just didn't have an answer for it. And this was around the time when I started talking more and more about supply chains, really getting over the tips of my skis and out of my depth of knowledge when it comes to supply chain, saying, I really think the bottleneck in being able to solve this is figuring out how to get supply chains to work better. And during this time, I found myself being asked to do more advisory work for United Nations, the White House, and then also for Fortune 500s. Because once we put out Slavery Footprint, we were promoted by the White House and promoted by the U.S. government as an organization for companies to come to. And we used that opportunity to essentially get our own PhD in supply chains and started connecting into large companies like SAP and others, and realizing that the next stage of whatever this story is that I get to be a part of was in building a SaaS product that could help companies organize their own supply chain, organize their own buying, and give them a way to be able to leverage their own purchasing power to help clean and organize their supply chains in line with their values. And that's been a journey I've been on for just over 5 years now with Freedom.
Well, that's a great summary. Thanks, Justin, for sharing that. Yeah, look, it's certainly an interesting topic. And Justin, just a bit off the cuff, I did want to ask you a question, if you don't mind. Um, Without going too much into the freedom piece, but certainly the sharing of data specifically around suppliers and such, and the journey initially around pushback around transparency, what was that like around, suppliers willing for their details to be registered, and having that supplier data free sharing component? Did you ever have initial pushback, like during the journey, that story, and how did that work? Did you have initial kind of pushback and resentment around sharing the information about their performance and their transparency from suppliers?
From companies that were willing to work with us? No, in fact,
No, more their suppliers.
yeah. So their suppliers don't have to be involved. We use a company's spend data, what they already have in house,
Yeah.
which yeah, there's clearly some proprietary and some privacy around that, which is well protected. But the
Yep.
idea here is how can we get started with what we have?
Yeah.
What I found was, oh, you need to audit. Oh, you need to do this. Oh, you need to do that. It's like, no, I think we can get started just with what we have in house, and
Mhm.
that intelligence is going to grow.
Okay. Okay. All right. So look, so we've got our first poll question. I'd like all the attendees, if you wouldn't mind taking a second to answer. So I'm just going to launch this. So the question is, how does your current employer rate on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest, for the commitment to adhering to the Modern Slavery Act legislation? So everyone can just take a couple of minutes or a couple seconds just to give us an answer. Just be curious to see what that looks like, and yeah, let's see how we go. All right, well, we've got a couple more to do, and then we'll end that. Okay, I'll cut it there. So from the attendees, I think, well, the majority of you feel like your company is doing what it can and is required to, and that's a great sign. I think certainly there's some there that think they can do more, but that's a bit of a pleasant surprise. That's great. Okay, thanks everyone. All right, so now we'll move into, Justin, just in terms of where Freedom's up to today. Can you give us a bit of background on where it's sitting and some of the work it's doing at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think we as a startup have learned as much from our customers that as we have from ourselves. I think we are in a process. We are learning as we go. The first challenge for us was, can we organize data in a way that's meaningful to take at least an assessment and a measurement, right? This idea that you can't fix a problem you can't measure. And can we get a decent measurement for our customers to help them kind of get their hands around where to look for first? And I think we're doing a pretty good job with that. I have to be clear that I'm a CEO, a startup CEO, and I tend to speak fiction, meaning I can see our roadmap and I can see where we're going, and I can almost talk about it as if it's happening right now. But where I'm seeing us where we're going is we're bringing in new data sources to be able to enhance and reduce the friction of being able to get very quick analysis out of spend data. So much of what we need to do is enhancing the spend data and organizing it in a way that it can be put together to where you can get quick, easy information. And a lot of what we're learning from our customers is how and what they want to do with that information. So we'll hear from our customers, oh, I need a map, or I need something that can, work with my CFO. And all of this is, great intelligence for us. And we move as fast as we can to put that together. But what we're seeing naturally, and we're always looking for what's the behavior we're seeing around this, is we are clearly seeing, and it's something we're glad to see, is we're seeing that there is a desired network effect where the shared burden of data enhancement and the work done to be able to interrogate and mitigate supply chains is something that needs to be shared amongst not just the team internally from the buyer, but also the suppliers themselves. So a lot of what we're building is building ways in which suppliers can now come into freedom, enhance that data, and lower the burden of transparency for our customers.
All right, so I thought it'd be prudent to show everyone just a very quick visual kind of summary around what freedom is here. So I'm hoping this video is going to work, but I think it should. So everyone just have a quick watch. This is about a 2-minute clip.
Tony, we're not hearing any sound.
You're not hearing any sound. Oh, I'm sorry about that. That's not working. Why is that not working? You know what? We'll just skip over that. Sorry. Apologies for the technical errors. Well, look, I'll send out the clip to all the attendees post the webinar.
Yeah, it's on the web. It's on the website. Yeah.
Sorry for that, guys. Okay, so we just got a couple more slides with Justin. So, if you wouldn't mind just finishing off just around, you know, the change in mindset from the 20th to the 21st century, and then we can move on to Scott.
Well, look, I think both Len and I are just very excited about the sea change that's happening in procurement. I think you have, I'm so glad that Tom's here. I think he represents the future of procurement,
Yeah.
Which are digital native, right? Young enough to be digitally native. And I think that I get excited about getting to be in this space because I can see transformation happening, not just in supply, not just in the business of buying, but also being able to create and build really great, powerful, virtuous networks that start to connect the dots and make the marketplace do the work of justice and of cleaning things up, and not just auditors and nonprofits. And I will say, at such a time as this, where the world has shifted, we absolutely need innovation and risk takers and first movers when it comes to being able to find new ways of using digitally native tools, whether it's ours or someone else, to be able to build resilient supplier networks. Otherwise, and I just need to say, I talk almost every day with partners, NGOs, folks working on the ground, whether it's in Ethiopia or whether it's in Cambodia, and everyone who's, you know, the front line of this issue has typically been governments and NGOs. And there's never been a more important time for the marketplace to be stepping in and stepping up in order to protect people, because as the economy rebuilds, it can go one of two ways. And this is an incredible time to be able to build smart and build a better network in order to protect people and planet.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, that's a great summary. Thanks, Justin. All right, so look, we're going to run our second poll question now for the attendees. So what tier of supplier do you feel is reasonable to review and assess their compliance within the Modern Slavery Act? Right? Is it the first tier, second tier, third tier? None at all. Just kind of interested to see what the attendees think around how deep down within your supply chain do you feel is reasonable to review and to dig into? All right, we'll just give it a couple more seconds here. Okay, so, all right, so I'll end it there. So look, I think the majority was at least the third or fourth tier. That to me signals that, you know, multiple layers within your supply chain, everyone believes is how far you should be going in terms of assessing your supplier base, their compliance for Modern Slavery Act, but also where the products come from, how they're manufactured, and how they're produced as well. So, okay. Look, thanks everyone for that. So now we're going to pass it over to Scott Alden from Holding Redlich. So Scott, if you wouldn't mind giving us a bit of an intro around Holding Redlich and yourself, and then we can get started in some of the content.
Sure, Tony, thanks very much. And thank you, Justin. It was great to hear you speak again. Justin and I were together in person on a panel with Deloitte when we ran a 4-part Modern Slavery Act series of presentations. Would have been probably well over a year ago now when the Act first came in and when people were really grappling to understand what they were doing. As for me, I'm a procurement and projects lawyer really, and have been for the last 20 years or so here in Australia, acting generally for government, but also private sector. My love of interest in and everything else regarding procurement sort of led me down the path of modern slavery, because that's really what modern slavery is about buying and about understanding what you're buying, where you're buying it from, who you're buying it from, and the sectors and things that you're engaging with, to see the extent of modern slavery in those procurement chains, supply chains, and then trying to understand them and, to the extent you can, remediate or reduce or educate along the way, which is all part of the legislation in an aspirational sense. And I'll come to the legislation a bit later. So I've been, as I say, doing procurement for a very long time. I also do quite a lot of pro bono work as well. And as I'm very concerned with the way the world can do bad things, and modern slavery is a bad thing. So when you tie those things all up together, it all comes up in a perfect sort of storm for me of being able to follow an interest, which is procurement, and also something very altruistic as well at the same time. And some of the work we do is pro bono and engages with not only sort of pro bono government entities and NGOs, but we also do quite a lot with the Freedom Hub, which is a local charity in both Sydney and the Gold Coast and Brisbane. And they have a social cafe where they employ modern slaves. They are a charity. They also have a survivor school where they take domestic victims of modern slavery and help them through the journey of staying in Australia and working and so on. And we, in fact, employed one of those people from the survivor school in my office about 6 months ago or so, which has gone very well. So we do a bit across the whole way. Sorry, Tony.
Sure.
Okay, so what is modern slavery? Is our first little slide there. And one thing to say about this in terms of procurement, and I got interested in sustainable procurement as well when the standard came out for that a couple of years ago, ISO 2020400. And sustainable procurement is split into 3 boxes, which is economic and environmental and social. And modern slavery is a sort of slice of social procurement in a sustainable procurement sense. So giving it some context, if you think about procurement as a broad umbrella, if you think about sustainable procurement as recognizing cost, the impact on the environment, and the impact on the broader society, and then modern slavery is within one of those 3 boxes that goes to the umbrella of sustainable procurement and procurement more generally. So I like to just give modern slavery, for me and for people I speak to, a bit of a home or a place in the world. It's obviously important in its own right, but in terms of a procurement specialist, which I am, that's sort of where it lives, is within that subset of sustainable procurement. Some things to understand about modern slavery are some people get a bit confused about what it is, and Australia is in fact the only jurisdiction that has defined it as to what modern slavery means and what it doesn't mean. And this slide here, which is taken from the Commonwealth Government guidelines on modern slavery and guidance for reporting entities, which is a very comprehensive and very useful PDF document put out by the Commonwealth Government. It's about 100 pages or so. It's easily findable online. You just go Department of Home Affairs or Border Force, and then reporting entities and guidelines for reporting entities, Modern Slavery Act. Google those keywords and you'll find it very easily. But it's one of the best things around and free of charge on modern slavery and modern slavery compliance. And from that is they adapted this slide here, which talks about, what modern slavery is and isn't, because people say, well, if I don't pay people properly, and there's been plenty of press around that with the likes of some restaurant owners, for example, and some chain outlets, 24-hour outlets, that supermarket sort of things. There's been plenty of press about all of those underpaying, grossly underpaying. And is that modern slavery? And the answer is most likely it isn't. And there's laws around to protect those things. So the Fair Work Act, for example. Equally, dangerous and substandard work conditions. So if you give somebody, don't give them the right personal protective equipment, then you're breaching your work health safety obligations, but you aren't necessarily engaging in modern slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So there sort of comes a point where that line is crossed, though, and where people are forced to work in unsafe conditions, or they're forced to accept low wages. And whenever there is that element of being forced, that's where that line is crossed. So there needs to be some kind of mental or physical coercion or duress or force or that kind of thing, or people might feel that, whether it's real or not, and that's where that line is crossed. So that's quite an important distinction to make, because people for a long time were misunderstanding that. You can move on.
So just a quick question. I was at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about Singapore, specifically in the construction industry, but another example I wanted to ask if this qualified was, so you've got they're classified foreign domestic workers, essentially helpers in Singapore, who are live-in nannies or maids, but there are a variety of ways that they're paid and housed within a living confinement. Some of the foreign domestic workers would have their passports taken off of them as well, right?
Yeah.
Would that qualify as modern slavery?
It would, yeah. So there's 8 types of modern slavery defined, and they go into forced labor, which is, so to answer your point, that is basically debt bondage, which is, and also deceptive recruitment practices. It will probably cross over that as well. Yeah. But an indicator of modern slavery certainly is where people have their identification documents or documents to freely move around the world taken off them. Passports is a classic, obviously, visas and things like that. And then you find them being sort of locked up. And then the unpayable debt is presented to you, and you have to work that debt off. But of course, you never can, because the interest accrues faster than the pay you're running. So.
Yeah. Okay. Oops. Sorry. There we go.
And so you mentioned construction, Tony, and that's an interesting thing to mention. And there's a couple of good sources. So these figures come from the International Labour Office biannual report on modern slavery. So again, Google those kind of search terms, you'll find it. It's a long, comprehensive report, and it looks at things like sectors and geographic regions. And so when we're going to our modern slavery risk assessment, which is something we have to do as part of the 7 criteria to respond to the legislation we have here in Australia. So we need to do a modern slavery statement if we qualify. So if you're an entity that has to report a modern slavery statement, 7 headings, 7 criteria, one of which is analyze your supply chain to see what the risks of modern slavery are. And the guidelines say that you should look at those risks through 4 different, basically into 4 boxes, because risk presents itself very starkly in 4 areas when it comes to modern slavery. One is the sector you're in, and that's really what this slide goes to. The other is where you bought the item from. The other is the product itself, and the last one is the entity that you're buying from. So the actual company or entity that you're buying from, they may have risks themselves, but primarily it's about where from and the sector. The other thing that we found early on was entities worrying that they would have modern slavery in their supply chain, and also entities that were asking of their suppliers to certify there isn't any modern slavery in their supply chain. And that's a very naive question. And in fact, no entity could do that in our view anyway, because as soon as you provide somebody with a computer, or you use a computer yourself, or you have an iPhone, for example, not picking on any particular product, but it's just any smartphone, they've all got cobalt in them. And cobalt is an example of a conflict mineral, and they come from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they are the 4th worst country in the world as a participant in modern slavery. So North Korea is the worst one of all, that's number 1. DRC is number 4. So all these devices have that metal in them, and that metal is, as I say, mined in situations of modern slavery without question. And so no entity can hand on heart certify or sign a stat deck that says we're modern slavery free, because nobody is. Right. So that's sort of the first point. about that. So that comes into this mining, quarrying thing here. And when you look at this sort of pie chart here, you take construction and mining together, you've got 24%, and that puts it as the highest. Other sort of sectors which are bad are clothing. So, you know, manufacturing, you mentioned clothing and running shoes, I think, Tony, earlier on, or it was you, yes. And so that's bad. Fishing and fruit picking, so agriculture, forestry, fishing, that's down there. And we have manufacturing of electronics as well and things like that, also high on the list of modern slavery risks in the supply chain, just as presented by this pie chart here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott.
No problem. So there's a couple of graphics to look at. One is sort of the prevalence of modern slavery, which I went to just then. Say North Korea is the worst, and you've got Pakistan, you've got India, you've got obviously some fairly less developed Asian countries, and you've got and African countries and the likes of DRC. That isn't this slide. This slide's about, you know, the response the government has taken around the world in relation to modern slavery and how strong that sort of response or addressing of that issue has been. Then the other slide, which comes from the International Labour Office, as I said before, that publication goes through gives you a pictorial of the top 10, the worst 10 countries in the world for modern slavery. So it's worth looking at that one as well in conjunction with this. So where is it bad and what countries are doing what about it? We can move on from there, so it's fine, thanks. So now we've got a couple of jurisdictions here in Australia which have passed a Modern Slavery Act, and I think, is it right, Tony, that all the people online are from Australia, or is it they from elsewhere as well?
I think the majority are here in Australia. We've got some in Singapore. We've actually got some from India. We've had a few from Africa. We've had a few from the US as well. So, you know, it's certainly spread out a bit more broader than I anticipated, which is a great sign for everyone. Yeah. But there are Australians here on the call.
Okay, thanks. Justin mentioned the Californian legislation, which was early and very kind of groundbreaking. So that's excellent. The transparency and supply chains kind of transparency legislation that it was passed in California. We then had the UK Act in 2015, which is passed, and the New South Wales Act and Commonwealth Act modelled themselves on the UK legislation. And there's more coming as well around the world. So countries such as Singapore and Canada have all got modern slavery legislation on their sort of statute books. Obviously, certain international global disasters and pandemics have slowed things down and people have been refocused elsewhere, but that will all come back on, I think, as we start to emerge from the situation we found ourselves in the last couple of months. And in fact, Tony, it's quite interesting to talk about that. And as Justin knows, because I've seen him post online about it, as have I, and we wrote a small article about it. The plight of the modern slave is in fact magnified at times like global pandemics where they find themselves stranded, even more subject to abuse and even more desperate than ever before. And there's plenty of articles to that point online and have been posted over the last few months. So it's interesting how different things impact other things. So the coronavirus has impacted modern slavery very negatively. Anyway, back to this. We've got New South Wales and Commonwealth. So the thing about Australia is multi-jurisdictional. We've got state-by-state laws and Commonwealth laws as well, often, sometimes working in parallel and sometimes being very similar but slightly different. And I won't go into too much detail about that. I could, but it would be a little boring. For all intents and purposes, we'll say they're the same, save for some important differences, and I'll just highlight those. So the differences between the legislation are, firstly, the Commonwealth legislation is actually up and running and therefore has to be complied with, whereas the New South Wales legislation, whilst having been passed, has not actually started yet because it's just being kicked around the various New South Wales government committees to see whether or not there's a place for it, or whether it needs to be amended, or whether it just needs to be taken off the statute books and we'll just fall back to the Commonwealth government position instead. So that's a work in progress. The answer to that question is coming in September this year, because the Social Standing Committee to which it was referred responded in about March of this year, and their report makes for great reading if you're interested in that level of detail. The report they came up with, and government has 6 months to respond. So New South Wales, as it says on this slide, have to reply to that by 25th September 2020. They can do it before then, and that will be then confirming whether the New South Wales Act will stay or go. The difference is, and it's unhelpful in some ways to have parallel streams that are different, but we've got the qualifying revenue for New South Wales at $50 million, a plus for an entity to then have to comply with modern slavery compliance and reporting. So 50 million for New South Wales, 100 million for Commonwealth. So that's a very important difference right there. The other important difference is that the New South Wales legislation has got actual financial penalties for non-compliance, whereas the Commonwealth government doesn't. Modelling itself on the UK doesn't have penalties for non-compliance either. However, the UK started off with no penalties for non-compliance, and it still doesn't have any, but in its 3-year review of legislation, which obviously has just occurred, 2015, 2018, there was a long review, late 2019, there was a report published about the things that were working and not working about the UK Modern Slavery Act. And there was robust agreement about the fact that basically penalties would be helpful, and they're going to start imposing penalties for non-compliance. So in that regard, New South Wales is probably a bit ahead of the game, but people are a bit fearful of putting penalties in, because in this space, they want people to actively comply in something that is seen to be a very positive thing to do, rather than be penalised for non-compliance. So it's a fairly hot topic, the whole point about penalties.
Sure. Okay. Look, that's a great summary. Thanks, Scott. So look, I'm just conscious of time. I was going to go through this quickly. What I'll do is, to the attendees, there's a great article here from McKinsey published the other day around transparency in supply chain post-COVID-19. So I'll go through that now, but I'll send the article clip to everyone to have a look at following today's session. So I'd like to now pass it over to Lynn and Tom. So Lynn, if you wouldn't mind just giving a bit of a quick summary in terms of where Freedom's at now here in ANZ, and then you can transition to Tom and Tom can talk about his journey through compliance with modern slavery and the customer experience Seek has gone through these last couple of years as well.
Great, thanks, Tony. Look, I'm going to be very brief, just mindful of time, but I just want to share kind of one thing. Freedom's theory on change is that basically a 21st century sustainability and supply chain challenge that we're dealing with here across slavery and other sustainability metrics can't be solved solely by old methods, being policy instruments and audits. Our theory is that this requires essentially a cutting edge technology solution to bring that transparency to risks which we all know often sit much, much deeper in our supply chains at tiers 3, 4, and 5. And that's where Freedom are here to support and enable organizations in identifying where those risks are and allowing organizations then to be able to appropriately direct their compliance and governance efforts. So I'm going to hand straight over to Tom, and Tom will take you through their journey as Seek and how they're addressing this big, hairy, audacious challenge that is a challenge for all organizations within Seek.
Thanks, Lynn, and morning, everyone. So for those of you who haven't come across Seek before, we're an online marketplace that essentially connects hirers and job seekers. And in Australia, that's principally through our seek.com site. Our purpose, more broadly, is to help people live fulfilling and productive working lives and help organizations succeed. And given that context, as a business and for all of us as individuals, it goes without saying that Seek is opposed to slavery in all forms. And this is particularly important for us because Seek's employment platforms in Australia and New Zealand advertise around 160,000 jobs at any one time. And so for a long time, we've acknowledged our role and responsibility to safeguard against the risk of modern slavery in advertising job opportunities. Now, from a supply chain perspective, and as Lynn said, the hairy problem that I'm leaning into, as a tech company, our risk profile is in many ways different to some of those other commodity-rich, geographically dispersed supply chains. But we're well aware that Australia as a country, and obviously tech as an industry, is not immune from modern slavery, and it can impact every industry and sector. And I think the principal challenge that I've found when actually leaning into this is that when looking at supply chain risk, we've got to deal with the problem of information asymmetry. So we, like I'm sure many of you have got good information about suppliers, commodities, and spend, but that's only one part of the problem. In order to understand that view of inherent risk, there are lots of other things that we need to understand. And there were some earlier comments about the level of depth in the supply chain that we go to that actually gives us that more comprehensive view on the inherent risk of modern slavery. So recognizing that information asymmetry, I engaged Freedom late last year to assist and enrich our existing data with their tools and some of the big data assets and risk indices that they have. Excuse me. Now, this has enabled us to perform some rather comprehensive inherent risk analysis on our supply chain, and I think go to a depth that might not otherwise have been possible, so certainly within the timeframes that we're dealing with. And what you can see on screen right now, albeit I think part of the diagram is missing, is a pretty high level view of our supply chain framework for modern slavery. And it's essentially a sequential approach to this challenge. So we're starting with an initial inherent risk analysis of the supply chain data, then moving on to that assessment phase of elevated risks that have been identified in that first phase, and then finally address or that remediation question, supported by broader continuous monitoring and recognizing also that distinct focus in both process and execution of legacy suppliers and new suppliers. If we move on to the next slide, using the Freedom platform, what we've essentially been able to do is take that existing supply chain transactional data that we have and then smash this together with some of those risk indices and big data from Freedom. And from this, I can now get a view on the quantum of inherent risk associated with modern slavery that combines those principal known factors of country and commodity risk, but also a view of the likely constituent parts of a given asset or service. So like a laptop or the mobile phone example that was given earlier, what is in that? And what are the risks associated with those countries of origin or those likely suppliers? Now, I think it's pretty important to call out that whilst this doesn't automatically give me the answers on which supplier my supplier uses 4 tiers down the supply chain and whether they are engaged in modern slavery, the most important thing that we were trying to resolve, if you like, in the analyze phase is help me understand where to look. And where to go into that next deeper phase. So essentially we have a kind of meaningful risk-based approach to subsequent phases of deeper assessment and then ultimately remediation. And I think without that view of the quantum of inherent risk, it would be really hard to confidently prioritize that next phase. So you can see I've put some examples on screen on what might be involved in that second phase of risk assess. So starting with maybe research, getting progressively deeper in questionnaires, management interviews, and potentially a site audit as well. But this really all leads up to that most important piece of remediation should an issue be found. I think whilst there are clearly processes and controls that are universally sensible, so due diligence, code of conduct, basic supplier scrutiny, meaningful remediation and responses to this legislation requires a fit for purpose response, most likely in response to each issue that's identified. And I'm like what Justin said earlier, I really don't believe that questionnaires alone are the solution here. And it's pretty obvious that the paperwork can't solve this global problem. But if you begin to reflect and certainly start trying to execute on some of the practical implications of this, you quickly end up with a few thousand organizations across Australia conducting analysis, which in some instances will be quite duplicative. I might risk assess a data center, and so will you, and so will you. And hopefully we come to the same answer, but in doing that, we would have expended time, effort, and money on essentially the same thing, things that maybe could be better spent on remediation. And as a previous risk management professional, whilst I think that duplication in risk analysis is probably no bad thing, that the more brains you've got pointed to identifying risks, particularly these kind of abhorrent risks, is a very good thing. But it does become quite problematic in terms of remediation. So, for example, if I find an issue and want to remediate with a supplier, 3 companies may find the same risk, they all might want to do a site audit. They all might want slightly different changes to supplier operations, all of which cost money and time. Most importantly, may not be coherent and may miss quite a meaningful opportunity that could have been better realized together. And so I think, whilst this is hugely supportive of this bit of legislation and what it's going to mean globally, I do think there's a bit of a gap in the broader regime here in terms of remediation, because whilst the obvious response to this might be to form industry-based groups or leverage forums, I think for a lot of us, it's not entirely clear the extent to which competition laws, commercial confidentiality, broader supplier agreements limit things like collaboration, collective negotiations, or the sharing of risk incidents and the status of resolutions. And I think that, in terms of, this is all a journey, but that end state is fundamentally important to bear in mind. And I do want to be really clear, I'm not being defeatist. I'm very much up for the challenge here, but I think one of the things that I've been exploring outside of modern slavery is third-party risk utility providers, essentially where risk analysis, assessments, and assurance or remediation activities are done once and shared with many. And I'm sure many of you, particularly in the procurement space, will be aware that the cyberspace, cybersecurity, is quite a mature offering in this utility space already. And I think that those utility providers will continue to expand across risk domains. And particularly platforms like Freedom are going to have a very key role as, I guess, the facilitators of collaboration in this space, which is really, for me, the next maturity milestone for progress in anti-modern slavery. So, I mean, I'll hand back to you in a moment, Lynn, but I think from me, it's very clear we've got a long journey ahead. Given the importance of the task at hand, we've got to get this right. But I truly believe that the collaboration is going to be a key part of our collective success here in eradicating modern slavery from our supply chains and societies more broadly. So, Lynn, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Tom. Look, nothing further to add from me. I'm just mindful. I'll pass the mic back to Tony because of pressing time.
Absolutely. So look, I think we'll wrap it here. Generally, we'd have a Q&A session. What I'll say to everyone who's attended, first of all, thank you for everyone who's attended today. Thank you to all the panelists who've spent time out of their busy days as well to share. I thought that was exceptionally insightful, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. In terms of the Q&A section, I'll be sending out emails to all the attendees today. If you have any questions specifically for any of the panelists, you can respond to me and I'll kind of point you in the right direction with some content or their contact details. And we can take it from there. As Lynn's pointed, it's 5 to 10 here in Australia. We've been going for almost an hour. So I think we'll wrap it here. Thanks again for everyone for attending. It's been a great session and I hope you all enjoyed it. And have a great day and enjoy the weekend. Cheers. Thanks, guys.